Good morning. It's good to see you today. Thank you so much for being here. I'm with Mike Ross, my friend. I'm going to introduce him to you in just a moment, but I want to, first of all, remind you of some things that are in your hand. If you're visiting Suncoast today for the first time, thanks for being here as a visitor. Thank you also for filling out the card. If you want some free stuff, like a free T-shirt and that kind of stuff, you can get it at Grand Central. They'd be happy to provide that for you. So, you know, I like the expression, if it's free, it's for me. So if you're a first-time guest and you want some free stuff, it's really a nice T-shirt. So we're happy to give it to you for free. So that's a good thing happening. In your notes today, you'll see some sermon notes. On the back of the sermon notes, there's a variety of announcements. In those announcements, there are some things that are happening in the life of the church. You can peruse those at your convenience and find out what's going on. I do know that there's an encore, which is a all-music night on October 10th. I just want to point that out to you. That is really a fantastic. If you like music, you know, it really offends me when a lot of people come to those things and there's no preaching. And they leave and they say, this is the best service ever. Yeah, I don't take it personal. Honestly, I sat in there and think the same thing. I just think it's the best ever, and I love the music, and it's a wonderful thing. So it's a music night, October 6th. You can see that in there, October 10th. Thank you. I said the wrong date. So the other things in there, please make a note of those. I do want to thank those guys who worked in the oil change and did that. You know, we serviced 31 cars yesterday, and a lot of people got a lot of help, and we did that for you. So you did that. So in reality, you make a difference every year. And as far as cars go, this year we've given away 20 cars also this year. A lot of people are getting benefited. We really want to make a difference in our community. We think that's important. So let's jump in today. I have my friend on stage with me. His name is Mike Ross. Mike Ross and I have been friends for many decades. And at one point in time, we worked together. He was my senior pastor, and I had the pleasure of serving with him. But let's just get started. Mike Ross, thanks for sharing the stage with me. You're my friend. He's also a board member of Suncoast. We have a board members since the beginning. We created 4 guys on the board, and he's been a board member for 20 years. And the other 2 guys are original board members. The board has never changed in 20 years. And what's the role of a board member? To support their pastor. That's a good role, isn't it? Just to having somebody that if I need somebody, I can call him. He's like for him, is the pastor's pastor. So, and that helps me in a lot of different ways. So, Mike, how long have you been in ministry?
I've been in career ministry about 48 years.
So, in my 37, that gives us 85 years. 85 years of ministry experience. You know what that means?
Nothing.
Pretty much, that's it. Pretty much. Throw her out. But it really doesn't mean much.
Could someone take this lady out? Or whoever it was.
She's used to it, don't worry.
Oh, okay.
So anyways, so been in ministry 48 years, and where have you pastored around the country?
I've pastored in Georgia, New Mexico, Missouri, Indiana, Florida, North Carolina. I couldn't keep a church, basically. They kept running me off, so I had to keep going. But
48 churches in 48 years is pretty good.
Yeah.
So what are you doing currently?
Currently, I'm working with an organization. I'm a troubleshooter for churches that are under stress. I go into a congregation and help rearrange things, so to speak, and get them going the right direction and solve problems after analyzing what the issue is. And just finished last Sunday in Kamiah, Idaho. Another part of the world, to be sure, but it was a great experience.
And tell me about your wife and your children.
Well, I have one wife, and
she's pretty famous, isn't she?
Many of you have heard of her, Diana Ross. Well, she's here this morning, and believe it or not, my brother's wife is with her, and her name is Betsy Ross. That's the truth. But Diana and I have 2 children. Our son is a minister in San Diego, and he and his wife have 2 children. And our daughter is an educator, and she and her husband also have 2 children in Indianapolis.
So, do you remember when we first met?
Unfortunately, yes. Now, Larry is actually one of the few that I actually remember the first time that I met them. And we were in a class, a Sunday school class, as they called it, small group on Sunday morning in Bradenton. And Larry and Becky walked in. I was impressed by him immediately, and our friendship grew from there.
Yeah, it was I was a young student studying for the ministry, and here was a guy that was, just a few years older that had already been in ministry, and we just had this instant affinity with one another. And we've been friends since the mid-'70s. So if you can put that together, you go, wow, that's a long time, over 40 years of a friendship. And
we are old, aren't we?
We are. She's right. She's right. That's just what I mean. But in 1981, I left seminary and moved to Lake City, Florida. And you hear me reference my first church experience. I was there for a little less than 2 years. And during that time, our friendship continued. Mike came and spent a week with me, and he kind of one of these, you have preaching every night. He was the guy that come in and do the preaching for the week. And then when he was done with that, everything was great. I thought, man, I love the way this guy preaches. He's a great preacher, because I really hadn't heard him preach very much. But in that cycle of my life, I thought, boy, it would be great to spend more time with him. And I called him a year later to say, Mike, do you know anybody else who could come and preach for me and have another one of these series? And in the course of that conversation, he was in Fort Myers, just new senior pastor there, and not long, and he invited me to be a part of his staff. Okay. And I drove down to Fort Myers, and I want to thank you, because I did youth and associate ministries, which means I did administration and some preaching, but also youth ministries. And can I be honest with you guys? Youth ministries is not my deal. I don't even like teenagers. I mean,
amen. We found that out.
So, we take them on a camping trip. We come back with quite a few less. So I was thanked by some parents. But the reality is, as I've gotten older, some things at that stage it wasn't right for me. But now I think I love teens more now than I ever have. It's because I don't have to work with them every day, right? And you can love them easier when you're not necessarily in their world. But that was a great job for me. And but what else did we do there together? Do you remember?
Well, we played a lot of racquetball, if I remember.
That was a great job. He'd make me go with him and play racquetball 3 times a week. Have you ever had a boss say, you have to go play racquetball? I'm your boss. And I just said, okay. No, not every game. No, we were very competitive, and it was a lot of fun. We were both very competitive. I don't want to brag about any of those games, because you never win, right? No, that's true. So, but what else what else did we do together?
I'm sorry?
What else did we do in Fort Myers together?
What am I supposed to say here?
Yeah. Well, let me help you.
Okay, help me.
We went to many conferences.
We went to conferences, yes.
We went to conferences together. We traveled a lot together. We really spent an extraordinary amount of time together drinking coffee. But it was a healing point in my life. I'd been a young guy that'd been kind of isolated in a North Florida town, and it was not the town as much as it was me. And I moved into a place where my heart really was healed, and you helped that process, and I'll be forever grateful. And our friendship was really strengthened there to the point to where, it was amazing. But I look back on those Fort Myers years with lots of affection. And I say that my life was different because of that. I want to thank you for that. So
yeah, I think one thing about Larry and I, we complemented each other. His skills were different than mine. So we worked very well together and developed a friendship. But it was probably a magical time for us, for Diane and I. We've never had it duplicated, but there was something, a chemistry in that congregation that was very unique.
And I was reflecting since our conversation last night about, you have a sweet spot in your life or a special time where you just remember everything is going well. And I think back on Fort Myers, I go, man, my life was so rich and full there. There wasn't a lot of stress. Life was good. And then I think about today and I realize that I'm in the zone once again. I'm in that place in my life, and I want to thank you for that, because you make that possible for me. It's a joy to pastor this congregation. You guys are wonderful, and many times I feel like I'm not deserving, and I probably am not, but I got here first. So that's kind of one of the criteria, for being in charge. You just get there first, and you get to set things up. But it's been my joy. But as a pastor, though, you've been a pastor for many years. What were some of the things as you pastored that you were not your favorite things?
I think my biggest source of frustration was the evolving expectation of the role of the pastor. When I first started, I knew what to do. Everybody knew what I was supposed to do, and I did it well. But over time, because of cultural shifts, what was expected of the pastor was very vague, varied within the congregation, so you couldn't win in a sense. And it was even more frustrating because these were mid-sized churches, so you had people with small church expectations versus large church expectations, and that caused a lot of frustration through my ministry career.
So being a pastor is not always it's not always fun and games. It's not always I'm doing my heart's desire. Sometimes we do things that are tough, and sometimes we've got our feelings hurt because we're human beings too. And sometimes we realize that we may have dropped the ball, we shouldn't have dropped the ball, and
right.
Sometimes we kick ourselves for that too. But despite all that, there's the tough times, but there's the good times. What are some of your fond pastor memories?
When someone asks me the highlights of my ministry, I always think of people, actual people that I knew, people who seemed to reflect a spirit of Christ. And we always tried to have them in our homes. We wanted our children to know these people, but it was godly people. Most of them didn't, as I reflect, didn't sing or teach or were not up front, but they were mostly conservative, but they weren't judgmental. They were open-minded, and I cherish those people to this day.
Well, that's wonderful. And there are some fond memories, and mine are about people too. I mean, it's about being in the place where you just feel like these are the most wonderful people in the world, and but it's not always like that every day, right? Because we just live in the real world. But we both grew up in a certain denomination. When we grew up in the Church of the Nazarene, and that's a very conservative evangelical church, and it's not that large of a denomination, but we both grew up in it. Mike grew up in Indianapolis, and I grew up in the Nashville area. But what were some of the challenges of growing up in that denomination for you?
I did grow up in Indianapolis, and as far as the Church of the Nazarene, that was the seedbed of conservatism, radical legalism. And I grew up with this set of rules that were impossible to meet, and if I didn't, I had all hell to pay. And it was hell, because I was trying to serve a God that I could not please. He was always angry at me. I was always falling short, and I couldn't reach any level of faith because of this legalism. It was extreme, and it pretty well ruined me. In fact, a lot of the kids in my age group have abandoned their faith because of that.
But what happened? Did you feel that way when you went to college?
I went away to college, and thank God there were men and women there who seemed, I had to admit, and it was a tough thing to admit, these folks love God more than I do. And I'm Mr. Straightlace. But they weren't legalistic. They lived holy lives in a sense, but they weren't, they were free. And it was a freedom that I cherished and sought for, and by God's grace was able to find.
So legalism was one of the things that was a challenge for us. And interesting, though, it's several ingredients there. One was the location in the country. You were in the hotbed of conservatism, and I grew up in Tennessee, which was a very conservative area as well.
Right.
But when I talked to my wife about that, she grew up in Bradenton, and it was a little more progressive down here, not quite so legalistic, wouldn't you say? And your wife shares a similar experience?
Yes, Diana grew up in Florida, and I took her home to meet my family, and my pastor said, "Don't marry her." I said, "Why?" "Well, she cut her hair, or you could see her knees." I said, "Well, that's what attracts me to her, you know." Plus, she didn't play the piano. Add all of that together, and he said, "Don't marry her." And that was the setting in which. So when we were first married, it was not always easy for me. Thank God for her maturity along the way.
No, I understand that very well, and it's interesting as I think about our heritage. We grew up in the similar environment, the same church structure, and legalism was dominant. Fear was very much a part of that. We were just afraid that one false move and you're going to spend eternity in hell. And so you're always in this fear of this God of wrath that's always out there. And the other frustration for me, even as I pastored, was the political structure of the church. So uncanny that that church decided to choose the political structure that mirrors the structure of our country. And if you don't like the way our country goes today, and you feel like there's a lot of tension between Democrats and Republicans in our country, that's the way it was almost in the church world. So polarized, different opinions, and you just had a lot of people trying to help you do what you needed to do. For me personally, it was a struggle because I felt like the structure kept me from leading the way I needed to lead. Mike was able to overcome that. He had better abilities in that than I did, but I just could not. I need to lead in a different way. So he stayed in the denomination and still is a clergy within that denomination. I bailed out 20 years ago and decided to start this crazy group called Suncoast, of which I will tell you, we both have our joy. And it is a joy for him and it is a joy for me. And we're in different places, but we still share the common ground. But it wasn't all negative. Growing up in that church, there were many positives. You know what I'm grateful for? I'm grateful to be where I am today. Without that heritage, I may not be here. So there are many positives. And what were some of the other positives about growing up in that denomination?
Well, the positives far outweighed the negative, or I wouldn't be here. But one was the feeling of belonging. It was a congregation that accepted me. I felt like I was one of them and I was safe. I felt at the age of 13 I was to be a pastor or a preacher. Told my pastor that, and he said, "Well, you're preaching next Sunday." And he got me up front, and that was helpful. To begin to learn back then the tools of the trade, so to speak.
And the other positives would be, one of the things that particular denomination really stressed was not only that you had to be in relationship with Jesus, but your lifestyle needed to reflect that. They talked about Christ-like living. What does that mean, Christ-like living?
I don't know. It's something I struggle to read. I see Christ-likeness in others more quickly than I think I will ever see it myself. So it's not something that's self-detectable, but you know it when you see it. And I've seen evidence of it. To give you an example, I was visiting a family, and I was sitting, they were fixing dinner. I was in their living room reading something, and they had a boy, 6, 7 years old, sitting across from me in the couch, and I cleared my throat. And I heard him go, I went, ah. And he goes, ah. And I look at him, and he's sitting like I'm sitting. So I changed my legs, he did the same. I crossed my arms. He was mimicking me. The mother of that boy came into the room and said, "You have children?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Do you have a picture?" And I showed her a picture of my daughter. And she said, "Oh, I can tell she's yours." And I think what I captured from the past was that Christ-likeness is not mimicking. It's not another set of rules, unlike the others, but it's a desire that I believe God changes our values, our sense of direction, and we become more Christ-centered. And as we do, people look at us and say, you must be one of his, so you're not conscious of it. We want to know we're making a difference, but I don't think we always do.
Right. And I think that that aspiration to become more, and we say it this way here, we want people to become the best version of who they can be.
Right.
To be the best Larry Baucom that I can possibly be is what I want to be. And I think that by the grace of God, that can happen, and by the Spirit of Christ. And we grew up with this in this denomination that did challenge us to live like Jesus. And I think that's always been good, because I think we should. One of the things that Paul talks about in Galatians 5 is called the fruit of the Spirit. Love, joy, peace, patience. They're in your notes. Kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. And at Suncoast, one of the things we're going to be doing over the next series is we're going to look at the fruit of the Spirit. We're going to look at each of these individually, and we're going to challenge you in some tangible way on how to reflect on that in your life. But the fruit of the Spirit, when you say it's part of this understanding of, those are characteristics that in some way symbolize, or Christ can be seen as an example of each one of those.
Yes, and that passage in Galatians 5 about the fruit of the Spirit is preceded by a statement, if you live by the Spirit, walk by the Spirit. In other words, if you have life in Christ, continue to live like him. And love is not an emotion. It's not, bless his heart, as they say in the South. It's not a feeling of empathy or sympathy, but it's an action word. It's becoming and doing and serving others. And to me, that's the key of Christ-likeness.
Yeah, I agree. So let me shift a little bit in our conversation. Last year in this country, 8,000 to 10,000 churches closed their doors. That's what happened. Those are statistics. 8,000 to 10,000 closed their doors in North America last year. Why do you think that is?
Well, there's certainly a shift going on in America now as far as religion and Christianity. And there's multiple reasons why churches close. Often it's finances. Church will become about the size of it needs to be to pay the bills. Then it stops growing. Well, now it takes more money to pay the bills, and some churches can't survive financially. But others they're not finding what they're looking for. They're not discovering something beyond themselves, so to speak.
So this great decline of churches, and we've seen it happen in Europe. And when it happens here, I think it's appropriate to ask questions. And the question I go, why is that happening? Why is the church losing traction in our country? And the next question I ask as a pastor, because I don't want to be one of those, what do we do to change the game? What can we do to modify what the church looks like to where it meets their needs? So I ask this question: what do you think people are looking for today in church?
I would guess or think that you're looking for the same thing I'm looking for. So I think I can answer that question with some degree of confidence. I think we're looking for, one, we want our lives to make a difference. We want to feel and believe that we've been used, that not in this negative sense, but that God has used us to make a difference so that we can see the tracks behind us. The other is we're all looking for something beyond ourselves. We're looking for a mystery to life beyond the senses, knowing that there's more to it than what we're able to see or feel. But there is a God who has created us and has a purpose for our lives.
So we're looking to figure out what that is. And if you can help us with that, we'd appreciate it. One of the things I noticed yesterday at the oil change, there was a guy that stopped by on his 10-speed bike. His name was Wolfgang. And one of the guys brought him to me, said he wants to talk to the pastor. So a guy rides up on a 10-speed bike at an oil change. You don't worry about changing his oil. And we were washing cars, so we weren't too worried about that. But he comes up and he's wearing his bike helmet and he's pleasant enough and he has a German accent. And he's, well, it's good to see you today. What I want to know is what you're doing here. And I said, well, we're changing the oil in cars and filters and washing and vacuum cars. And he goes, why? I said, well, it's what we do as a community. We want to give something back. He said, well, what does it cost? I said, it's all free. Are these people from your church? No, just anyone in the community can call and have their oil changed once a month. He said, when is it? So it's the last Saturday of the month. He said, really? And you can see him pondering. He goes, can I help? And I think a chord was struck with me there. I think people want to be involved with something. They want to give back in some measure. It's part of who we are. He says, do I have to attend your church to help? And I said, you do not. The last Saturday of the month, just show up and we'll put you to work. He said, oh, good. I look forward to it. And again, people, we need to find out what people are looking for today. Culture shifts. Society shifts. I think the message and teaching of Jesus has been the same for many years, for thousands of years, and we just got to implement that to our culture a little better. But today, after a life of experience, you look out over my group, and I claim you as my family and my community. So you look out over these people who are very receptive to what you have to say, and you could give them some advice. If you give them any advice today, what would it be?
My advice to all of you is to never settle. Never reach a place where you say, this is where I'm supposed to be in my spiritual development. This is a good place. I'm going to settle here. There's always more. And I think I've grown more in the last 2 or 3 years than I have previous years in a 10-year period. There's always more. So don't settle for where you are, but continue to pursue Christ-likeness. Something you said, well, I don't know which church father it was. It might have been Ignatius, but said, preach the gospel at all times, but if you have to, use words. And I think how we live, to live as Christ would live, so that people see him in us, should be our goal, and we all fall short of that, so we have to keep growing.
Agreed. Now, you told me a story recently about a teen event where a girl was singing on stage. Tell us that story.
It was a life changer for me. I was leading a church in the program I'm now in, and the teens had a fundraiser night, talent show type thing. They had magic and skits and so on. And one girl sang for that program. The whole congregation was there practically. And she started out very well, but I don't know if she forgot her words or she got scared, but she just began to fall apart. Her voice got weaker, and the music was still playing. And my heart went out to her. Well, one of the youth leaders jumped up out of the crowd, went up on the stage, and just stood next to her. Just didn't say a word to her. Occasionally, she'd reach out and put her arm around her, but just stood there. And the girl looked at her and said, what are you doing here? You could just see it on her face. And finally, she realized that this leader had come to just be with her. And her voice got stronger, and she picked up her head, and she finished strong. And the congregation there just went wild. They loved it. And later I told the girl, I said, the lady that went up to her, I said, that was so inspiring. I said, but I noticed you didn't sing along with her. She said, I didn't know the words. And it was an aha moment for me, because I think sometimes we feel like we need to have the answers, or we need to give advice. We need to know what to tell them. But nothing takes the place of just being there. And sometimes I've gone in situations, I didn't know the words, but I went and stood beside people. There's nothing greater. I think that's what Christ would do. And I hope you will always find someone who's struggling and just stand beside them, be with them, and encourage them. You might see their life change just as that gal's demeanor changed that evening.
That's a good word, isn't it? And that's true. In the life of Suncoast, there's been a couple times, even a couple years ago, I got on the phone and I called a friend of mine and said, hey, some things are going on I want to talk to you about. He said, let me fly down. And he flew down to where I was and stayed here for a couple days. And And that was my good buddy right here that's on stage with me. He's done that for me. We all need someone like that, don't we? Yes. And here's what's amazing. Even if I don't have someone like that for me, maybe I can be someone like that for someone else. That's the challenge. Would you stand with me? We're going to pray together, and then I'm going to tell you a story. But Father, thank you for this day, and thank you for our friendship. Today we've heard the advice. Somehow, if we can be a person that just will stand by someone, that's the challenge to us. Father, we ask that you would help us to see with our eyes open and our hearts fully engaged in our community. Pray, Lord, that you'd help us to be the best version of we that we can be today. But thank you for your love and grace. Thank you for your presence in our lives. Thank you for teaching us how to live faithfully. And a life of faithfulness, it helps us to be who we can be. Father, do your work in our lives to make that so, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen. I'm going to tell you a story in closing, and before I do, remind you, if you want to pray, there's someone up front who would be delighted to pray with you. Also, secondly, there's going to be some information on the screen about Escape the Woods. It's really about scaring the daylights out of teens. So if you want to be involved with that, you can follow through on that as well. But there's another one of the board of directors. One was here last night, Greg Reiner, and the other guy, Kevin Hawk, lives in Oklahoma. And Kevin watches us regularly. So, Kevin, if you're watching this, thanks for tuning in. But 2 or 3 years ago, I flew out to Oklahoma to be with Kevin. He's in a new hospital situation. I wanted to be a person who stood by him. When I got there, he picked me up and very gracious. He's meticulous with everything in life. And we went to a Mexican restaurant for lunch. And as we were driving from the airport to the restaurant, what I noticed is he had something going on with his cough. He had one of these nasty, and all I could think of, the same thing you'd be thinking, oh, great. I'm going to be with this guy for 3 days. I'm going to be stuck with him for an hour in the car, then at the restaurant, then up for his house, and he's got some kind of plague, and I'm going to get it. I need to make sure I keep as much distance as I can. And we're sitting there eating chips at the Mexican restaurant. We started on the second basket of chips, and we're talking. And about 2 or 3 chips in, he looks at me and says, hey, I just need to let you know, you're drinking my water. Yeah. Can I suggest to you today, in the Old Testament, it talks about a stream of water that flows from God. In the New Testament, Jesus embraces that and says, if you believe in me, streams of water will flow from within you. If I'm going to drink any water today, if we're going to drink the water, let's drink the water that flows from him. It helps us be more like him. I'm just here to remind you, he loves you today. So do I. God bless. Thanks for coming.